nature is full of different creatures of different inclinations. And it is the same in the spiritual world. We must learn to regard various ways of thinking as something beautiful. There are as many religious ideas as there are believing souls. So we cannot force everyone to measure up to the same stick. Only God, according to his infinite wisdom, knows how to deal with every soul. I'm going to talk a little bit about spirituality in the Camphill villages. And I feel a little nervous because there are here people present who are far more qualified than I to do so. And on the other hand, there are people here who I don't know where they come from. So I'm going to do a little scientific survey before I start. And I want you to indicate how much you think you know about Camphill. Now, the indication like this means that you know quite a lot. The indication like this means that you know nothing. And then there is a scale between the two. And I'd like you all please to put your hands up like this and give me a thumb indication of roughly where you are. Okay, thank you very much. I see enough people doing this that I do need to spend a few minutes at the beginning just giving you some background. Okay? I don't have very long, so you have to bear with me, and you people who know all about it can correct me afterwards. In the 1930s, a group of intellectuals gathered in Vienna to study anthroposophy, the spiritual science that was initiated by Rudolf Steiner. In 1938, the Nazi Germany took over Austria. To be radical was not a good idea. It didn't fit with the Nazis, and many of those radicals were Jewish, so there were two good reasons why that group left Vienna. They scattered worldwide. Their focus person was a doctor called Karl Koenig. He went to Great Britain and was given by the anthroposophical network in Great Britain, was given a house in Scotland near Aberdeen, and he got in touch with the rest of the scattered group. He says, we have a house here, we can gather here, and those ideas that we've been studying, we can put into practice by opening a school for children with special needs. It is important to know that in the 1930s, children with special needs, especially those we now call Down syndrome, they another name them, they're called mongoloid children. They were defined officially in the encyclopedias as idiots incapable of learning. They started the school. A little bit of a story. I'm not going to go into details here. The school grew. They moved to another house, a larger house called Camphill House. And this new way of looking at the child with special needs as a full human being capable of developing qualities according to anthroposophical principles was so welcoming to many of the parents who had such children, who didn't like to be told that their child was an idiot incapable of education, but were actually welcoming somebody saying, this is a wonderful human being, and we're going to create a school and a society that this being can be in and flourishing and developing. So there was a tremendous rise of these schools. More and more were started up throughout the 1940s, inevitably. You know what happens to children? They grow up. And the parents, again, they say, well, what are we going to do? We have wonderful schools. And then they stop. Well, Koenig said, let's make villages. And so he was quite specific that these villages were for creating a fellowship where people with special needs would live and work alongside people who would help create a fellowship where everybody could contribute something. And at the beginning there should be no teachers because these are not children, these are adults. In 1955, 1956, Botton Village in North Yorkshire opened as the first village for adults, and it also got the name Camphill Village, even though Camphill House Estate is a school for children even today. And the Camphill movement grew and grew through the 50s, through the 60s. It started growing in North America, in Ireland, North America, England, Scandinavia, and I don't want to go on for a long thing here, but today, in 2013, we have something like 120 something villages and schools in 20-something countries, and I think the only continents that aren't in there are South America and Antarctica, and maybe Australia. I think all the other continents are covered. So, and it's growing at the rate of 1 or 2 every year or two. That's the history. Well, that's pretty quick. Gilman's for you there. The Camphill villages are per se ecological. They usually work with biodynamic farming, which is organic plus. The Rolls Royce of farming. They try and be self-sufficient, not because that is a virtue in itself, but because with fairly simple, and we talk about moderate needs, you can actually provide much of what you need yourself. And simple work, often done with the hands, is something that people also with limited physical and mental capabilities can carry out. And by being part of the baking crew, even somebody with very limited capabilities can feel to be the provider of the bread in the family house. And we have found within Camphill that the contribution you make to the fellowship increases your self-worth and your self-development as a human being. And so self-sufficiency is a vehicle for self-development. Just to give a brief example, I have theoretically sat in a Camphill house and eaten off tables and chairs that were made in the carpentry workshop with a tablecloth woven in the weavery with candles dipped in the candle workshop lit at every meal, of plates and drinking from cups made in the pottery workshop, eating bread that was made in the bakery from wheat that was grown on the farm with jams, and I would go on with the meat and the milk and the vegetables. You get the idea. I don't think we get to salt. We probably won't. The houses are organized so that people live in family-sized units. Unlike the Hutterites, unlike the kibbutz, each family lives in its own house. Usually the classic house is 4, 5, 6 people with special needs, a family, maybe with their children growing up there, and 2 or 3 young co-workers. This is what we like to think is the classic Camphill family house. But less and less of them because change is also coming to Camphill. But we're not here to talk about change. We're here to talk about something much more, much deeper. And we're talking about the spirituality. Now, I mentioned Rudolf Steiner at the beginning, and anthroposophy. These villages grew out of the worldview of anthroposophy. I'll try to sum up that in one minute. Steiner took, was it 7,000 lectures? Out Gilman and Gilman here. Anthroposophy is based on the idea that there is a spiritual dimension as well as a physical dimension. And that this spiritual dimension is the wellspring, it's the foundation. It's where the physical dimension gets its shape from. And anthroposophy is known as spiritual science because it studies this spiritual dimension in a scientific way with the idea that we, the human being, are the creature, the creature that has the bridge between these two. And our task is to make that link between the spiritual world and the physical world. And the Camphill communities try and put these ideas into action in a living way. Now we could spend the next week talking about different aspects of that. The social aspects, economic aspects, the spiritual aspects of reincarnation. And really, 20 minutes is not a long time. But Camphill grew directly out of that anthroposophical tradition. Just like Steiner schools grew out of that, biodynamic agriculture also grew out of that, and there are a whole number of different human strivings that come from that idea, including a dance form known as eurythmy. There are musical traditions that come out of there, architectural traditions, and anthroposophy goes back and looks right back to Goethe's scientific view of the world, and there's a whole field now of Goetheanism, which is a scientific exploration using anthroposophy as its foundation. So Camphill is a small part of a much bigger construct. There is a lot of Christianity in Camphill, and this is one of the really fascinating meeting points right now. In anthroposophy, the development of the human being through history hinges on an event which is often called the Golgotha event in anthroposophical terminology. We might call it the crucifixion in a more mainstream Christian wording. Basically the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Once that becomes the kind of leverage point, the turning point, the hinge upon which humanity is dependent, you're kind of Christian. It's hard to be not to be lumped in with all those other Christians. So there is a Christian element in the very thoughts of these things. The year, as it passes round, is celebrated by Christmas, by Easter, by St. John and St. Michael. Well, it's a dead big order. Pretty Christian if you're celebrating those things. So there is a very strong Christian thing, but I didn't read you that quote for nothing. That was Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who lived in 300-400 years ago, and he is regarded to be one of the leading lights, the inspirations for Camphill. And there is a universal aspect which says that the Christ impulse is a universal impulse, and it could actually be called the Buddha impulse just as well, because at a certain depth, names fall away, and what you're left with is the impulse, which is actually the important thing. And so there is a universalist aspect to this, which allows access to other people. And one of the interesting developments over the last 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years, is the emergence of Camphill villagers in India with a Hindu background, and in Vietnam with a Buddhist and a communist background. And in the short time I have, I just want to quote something from the Peaceful Bamboo village, which is the Vietnamese village, which became a full Camphill member, I think a year ago, am I right, a year ago? Where they said that we have here people, co-workers and residents, who have different backgrounds. Some are from a Buddhist background, others have a communist worldview background from the communist era, others are Roman Catholic backgrounds, because Vietnam was a French-type colony mandate for many years, and others have no spiritual background whatsoever. But there's one thing we share, and that is that we meet the other human being as they are with what they bring with them. And at that meeting point, we make a connection and we can start working together. And in a way, I would like that to be a definition of anthroposophy, at least in the human level, of meeting people as they are, face to face, and accepting them for what they bring with them, and actually celebrating what they bring with them. And I think that spiritual aspect of it lies at the core of the work in Camphill. It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to switch off the loudspeakers, because there is also something about the voice and the ear, and that when it goes directly from my voice to your ears, there is a more direct connection than having it go through a machine first. So it's a part of the practice. I'm aware of the time. I'm going to round off with just one last story here. And that is to tell you about reincarnation, which is a hot potato, because in our culture we think it's pretty weird. In India it's great, everybody does it, so it's no problem to talk about it. But we in our culture think it's a bit weird. And one of the great things about Rudolf Steiner is, he says in many places, you don't have to believe me. In fact, don't believe me. But feel free to try the thought. And I'm very ambivalent about reincarnation, but living in Camphill, I've tried the thought. And if you try the thought of reincarnation, then it implies that we are spirits who come into a physical body for our allocated 3 score years and 10, some more, some less, and that we choose to come into this body in some way. Now, why would we ever want to do that? Isn't it much better out there? No, because we need to be in these bodies in order to develop ourselves through the challenge of being in a body. Well, it's not much challenge being a comfortable middle-class person in the West with all your meals and all your senses and having fun and going to university. That's a challenge, really. But if you're a really developed soul, you say, hey, I'm going to go back with no speech and uncoordinated movements and try that for a while. And that sounds pretty weird, but if I'm working with that person, with the uncoordinated movements and the challenge of speech, and I see that person as a really developed soul who is coming back here and is scaling Everest without oxygen, right? It's the same thing. Wow, what a privilege for me to be able to work with that person, and how that changes our relationship from me feeling sorry for you because you can't walk, to me being honored to be with you, and maybe, together we can learn something. And the change of that relationship, trying the thought, creates a completely different way of living and working with people who have special needs. I'm out of time. I don't know what I'm going to say anymore. I'm not sure I talk so much about spirituality. But there's a paper you get online. And read it at your leisure. But I've maybe given you some taste of Camphill, and I've tried to give you some taste of the underlying thing of Camphill. That was my aim. I see I have 5 minutes left for questions, but I'm allowed to do that. Right?
First, let's thank you.